Hey. Welcome to episode 221 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Freeman. And for those of you who've watched for a while, you might notice I'm not in my usual dress shirt. There's two reasons for it. One, it's really cold and windy outside in South Dakota today. If you're in a warmer place when you're watching this, be grateful. Cold weather is, really cold. That was obvious. But the bigger reason why I'm wearing a t-shirt and this whatever this is, this kind of a sweatshirt, kind of a sweater, who knows? The bigger reason I'm changing it up is because my guest today, she's a poet, and poetry really challenges us to see our lives differently, to see our lives in maybe an expanded way, in not only our own lives, but the people around us and our environment in an expanded way. Sometimes it's easy to get in the way of perceiving our world in the same way over and over again. But really life is so much more than that. So I'm excited to talk to my guest. I'll tell you more about her, but first this.
Today's guest, Jennifer Soule.
Well, welcome back. Jennifer Soule is a great many things. She's a retired social worker and therapist, a retired social work professor, a person who has lived all around the country. My dad's neighbor and friend when they were kids. My classmate in an MFA program. That's a Master of Fine Arts. We got Masters of Fine Arts in poetry. She's also the daughter of a mom who is 101 years old. Lynn, who's been a guest on Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. And owner of a big dog, Elliot, who is named after the poet T.S. Eliot. And we might hear from him later in the show. She is not only a poet, but a poetry therapist. And she has a whole bunch of initials behind her name. B.A., M.S.W., M.F.A., Ph.D. She has published poems in various journals and anthologies in her poetry book Winter Woman by Kelsay Books came out last year. This book follows the release of Hiawatha Asylum, published by Finish Line Press, and Postcard Days, published by Cherry Creek Press. Please welcome to Awkwardly Awesome Podcast, Jennifer Soule. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Jason. I'm happy to be here.
So, there's so much to cover. Let's start with poetry a little bit, and we're going to move back and forth through your life, and because your life has been vast and encompasses so many things, so we want to just celebrate all the wisdom you have to share and all the metaphors and such. So and I don't think I ever asked you this question, which is amazing. How did you first come to be interested in poetry?
Well, I think it really started probably when I was a child. My mom read poems to me a lot. She read a lot of poetry. My dad was going to school on the GI Bill at Augustana. And while he studied, she read to me. And part of what she read was all of the childhood poems, the Garden of Verse and Mother Goose and all the childhood poems. And I really liked them, and I loved reading. And actually, I grew up thinking, which is probably why I became a college professor, that all people did was read and go to school. So that's what I did most of my life. That was my early introduction. Was my mom, and my mom loves poetry, as you know.
How do you think your mom got interested in poetry?
Well, I think she did it in high school. She went to Harrisburg, and she was the editor of their high school paper. And high school then was more like undergraduate college now. And she was given a medal by at graduation for being most interested in literature and art. And that's probably her prized possession. So I think I may have come by it fairly naturally from my mom.
So you had this early exposure to poetry, but have you been writing poems since then, or was there a period of life where you didn't write poems?
Yeah, during most of my early graduate school, when I was working on my master's in social work, I didn't really write poetry. When I was teaching at Shepherd University in West Virginia, I started writing poems again, and I was part of a poetry group, the Bookend Poets. We met in a bookstore and shared poems, and I started publishing. Well, the newspaper there published a page of poetry once a month.
Oh, cool.
And they published our poems, and I had a poem published in the university poetry journal. So that was probably in the 80s and 90s when I was part of that group and was doing that. So I really got interested again in writing poetry, and some of my closest friends were on the English faculty, so we shared poetry and talked about poetry a lot. And it became more of a passion. And then once I retired, I decided I wanted to really focus on poetry. So I read more. I wrote a lot of poetry. We lived on a boat for a while in the Keys. I wrote a lot of poetry there. When we came back to South Dakota, I was writing more poetry, and I decided I wanted to study it more. So that's when I decided to go into the MFA program at the age of 59.
That's awesome. That's awesome. There's so many threads here. Another passion in your life has been social work. How did you first get interested in social work?
Well, I think I was interested in it a lot as a kid because I was concerned about people who seemed to be on the margins. But then after I finished my bachelor's degree, I decided to become a VISTA, which is Volunteers in Service to America. And we lived, this was the late 60s, 69. So we lived in poverty and we worked with poor people. And this is sort of like the domestic Peace Corps. And we worked with very poor people in poor communities. And I'd wanted to be in an urban area, but they said, since I grew up in a rural area, they needed me in a rural area.
So where were you?
I was in southern Indiana, which is actually sort of the end of the Appalachians. So I was working with people who lived in mountains, and we did a lot of door to door. And I worked pretty closely with them. And at that time, VISTA was less providing services, and we were supposed to organize people into political groups so they could have a voice. And we had a lot of meetings, and we had a lot of one-on-one, which I think community organizing and social work really is about, one person to one person. And I really liked that. And then I became a community organizer, and I worked with legal aid. And they were trying to do a case to continue welfare payments during summer months when they cut them off because they thought everybody could work. But I mean, I got a real taste of poverty and social injustices, and I sort of feel like I have a PhD in poverty and social work because that was my focus, and I was really very active. I thought about going to law school, but then one of my friends said I probably wouldn't do that because I'd have to put my values on hold for a while. So I decided to go into social work and see if I could work within the system to make some changes. But my focus has always been on social justice and social change, even though I also did psychotherapy, which is also about change. So.
For sure. What did you learn about poverty from living in poverty that surprised you?
Well, it was really difficult and we got bed bugs. I wasn't planning on bed bugs, but we had to live on a poverty level income. And so we had to be pretty frugal, and people didn't like the fact that we were organizing people. And one of the groups we were working with was getting some welfare rights people together, and that was definitely not very popular in Indiana. And they actually burned a cross on our lawn, and they harassed us. And so I got a pretty good taste of people in poverty being harassed. I mean, we were harassed because we were working with people in poverty, but their lives were really difficult, and because they couldn't afford a lot of legal assistance, they frequently ended up in jail where other people would not have, because they would have been able to afford a lawyer. So I learned it was really hard, and I learned you had to be pretty creative. People would invite us over for dinner sometimes, and we always were happy to get a meal because we didn't really have that much money for food, and we were working a lot. So And then we'd also decide that we could take a shower since we were in the house. But you become pretty creative in using what you have and stretching money. So, I mean, that's also part of writing poetry. I mean, you see things differently when you observe them, and then you write about them.
So along with this conversation, will you please read?
Sure.
Read the what's the full title of the McDonald's poem? Is that the end of your book?
It's homeless at McDonald's. And I noticed this when my late husband, and I were at McDonald's. A mother and grown daughter live quietly in a blue Chevy van parked at McDonald's at 41st and Minnesota. Rusted van, a window duct taped shut, packed to the roof with boxes, blankets, lamps. The mother limps on bandaged foot, balances coffee. Her daughter shuffling behind with Egg McMuffins and condiments. Here they eat and use the restroom near the brightly colored kiddies' playground. Homeless women aren't in. Jingles. Management doesn't police the parking lot. The staff can picture being in that car. Knows everyone can't live in comfortable homes, too busy to cook healthy meals with soccer, dance, piano, basketball. McDonald's meals are happy ones with toys. These women live here, hiding furtively, a movement in the dumpster's neon shadow, homeless in corporate, beneath the golden arches of America.
It's just so vivid and really shows how you have empathy and can kind of really get into other people's experiences. One of the vivid things about it, that a person wouldn't know unless they were from Sioux Falls, is a Minnesota Avenue and 41st Street, like the two main business streets in Sioux Falls, the malls on 41st Street with all the big stores, and here are these people suffering in the midst of all this abundance.
That's a good point, Jason. Yeah, and I don't think we notice people trying to make it. I just think people that are on the streets are maybe noticed, but people frequently are afraid of them. I did a lot of work. I did your basic social work sabbatical in a homeless shelter for women and children, and they were just really great people. And I was with a photographer who was taking pictures and gave the kids cameras, and I did writing groups with the women.
No way! Wow.
And then we did the university or college or whatever. I mean, we used to be colleges, and now they're all universities. But we had an exposition at the art school in the gallery, and Benita also taught in the art department, the photographer, and she had pictures of the kids and the women and the place, and then we had words that they'd written across the top and on the walls, and we had it set up like a kitchen table, which is where I usually did the poetry groups, and everybody came, and the people from the shelter came, and the college president came, and they really liked it, and the kids were so happy. And this is interesting. and you'll know this with your social work background too, they were so happy that people saw them and they weren't anonymous. People usually say, well, you shouldn't use names. And we wrote a book, and I changed all the names, and the book did win a Dorothea Lange and Paul Taylor award, but it wasn't published because it had photos, and everybody said, well, that's too expensive to publish. But I think what was most interesting is how happy they were that everybody was there and talking to them as real people and not as outcasts. So I mean, that's sort of been a theme in my life, and they loved. I did poetry groups with them, and the women loved to write poetry. They just got so excited about writing poetry. One person went out and found a typewriter and brought it in and typed up her poems. But people think that they may not be interested, but they were really excited. And I think poetry does speak to everybody because it deals with your core self and your feelings, and you can put them into images and metaphors, and even without understanding the specifics of poetry, these women really got into writing. And I sent one of the poems off to they still published poems in things like newspapers like Welfare Rights. And I sent one of the poems off, and she was really excited. I think people get excited about seeing a poem and their name in print, and I think people get excited if they're appreciated for themselves and not. And I think this poem, Homeless at McDonald's, sort of speaks to that too, indirectly. I mean, these women aren't visible to the rest of the world, even though it's pretty obvious.
So, I mean, this is getting to be a rich conversation about a subject I hadn't anticipated, but is very rich. So, first of all, will you say more about how writing poems can be very healing and cathartic for people?
Yeah. Well, I think mainly, first of all, it slows people down. And we live in a really fast-paced world where everybody is sort of too busy. And when you sit down to write, you slow down, and even the process of writing is slow, and it takes you inside yourself. So you start having thoughts on experiences that you've had in the past, and things that you would not necessarily consider. When I do poetry therapy groups, I use a prompt, and people are always surprised they write about their lives in some way, and what they learn just from the writing process, which is really healing, to recognize what's inside ourselves, because we don't really take the time to do it, and we don't take the time to observe our surroundings. I mean, I know you do, and I think walking is one way that you can observe nature, and nature is very healing. And I will frequently have people walk outdoors, and I did a haiku retreat at your parents' place.
Yeah, it was lovely.
And people loved it. They were so happy, and people always think that they can't write poetry and that there are a whole bunch of rules that you have to follow. And it's mainly about getting down feelings and images, and sometimes they become metaphors, but there's a music in it, and actually even our regular speech is musical. But people do have concerned about. If I say I'm a poet, which I don't say too often, but they get all freaked out, like I'm going to be analyzing how they're talking or something. And poetry is a way of expressing your deepest feelings based on what is going on inside, and that's what's healing. And there's been a lot of research on it that writing is really a healing process.
And your dog is a poet too, and he's expressing, T.S. Eliot is expressing his feelings right now.
Yeah, he is, because he hears my voice and he can't see me. He's really attached to me. He was my husband's dog, and he was always near him. And he's actually very quiet if he can see me. But he doesn't like it when I'm talking to other people.
So I can think of people watching this, and there's been times in my life like this where kind of go, oh, that poetry stuff is good for other people, but I'm not creative. I'm not creative at all. What would you say to someone who feels that they just don't have a creative bone in their body?
Well, I always say we're all creative, because
Why?
well, we live our lives by putting things together and figuring things out, and we just don't think that we're creative. My mom would say that, and she raised 6 kids, and she writes poetry, and she would say, "Oh,
And she's 101.
yeah." But I think people, and she's been in poetry groups, so she's gotten somewhat better in terms of accepting the creativity, which I think was always there. It was always there, and you have to be fairly creative to raise 6 kids who aren't really easy to deal with, and who are all pretty different. And I think we demean the creativity that's part of our lives. And actually, I was just reading a book about art in the Torah, and that's because I'm trying to call my books, because I have like 15,000 books, and it's kind
You
of
said like 15,000?
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Well, I'm sort of a book nut, so I've been going through some, and I find ones that I bought for some reason, and I didn't necessarily read them, but I started looking at that one, which is why it takes me so long to call my books. And the author was talking about how in the Torah, the first books in the Torah are all about God and creation, and part of it is it being created in the image of God, and that makes people co-creators, which I thought was a really interesting take that I had never really thought of. But I think we are creative, and we think it's only a few people who write or paint or do something. But once people start writing, they realize that they can be creative. Sometimes we don't have the time. Elliot, be quiet. Sometimes he's quiet if I say that. Not always, but I think it takes a lot of time. And I think it takes, a lot of musing, having some solitude, having some time to walk. I need a lot of time. That's why when I was teaching full time and going to school, it was harder to write poetry. You really need some space.
So back to your poem about McDonald's. Like for those of us who are living middle class abundant lives, like how do we we start helping out. How do we interact? The problem of poverty seems so incredibly vast and overwhelming. Where does someone start who has the challenges of their own life to also figure out?
Well, you don't have to do things that are really dramatic. I think sometimes what helps is just talking to somebody who's poor and listening to their story. And I think people are afraid of people who are poor or living in poverty, partly because they're afraid it could happen to them, which it could. I mean, anybody could lose everything all of a sudden, like now all those very wealthy people in Los Angeles are homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't necessarily think that they could have become homeless because they had wealth. But I think talking to people, and what I did with my classes, I usually took my social work classes down to DC to serve at the it's called So Others Might Eat. It was a kind of like the banquet in Sioux Falls. It was a kitchen where homeless people could come in and have a meal and be treated as guests, and they would sit down and talk to them, and they would serve the food. And I think food brings people together. Sometimes just having a meal or even a cup of coffee with someone. I know I've had friends whose people have asked for money, and they said, well, I won't give you money, but I'll buy you a meal and we can talk.
Mm.
And I think just having some interaction with people who are different, which we don't do that much. I mean, we usually stay pretty much in our own world. But I think volunteering, which is why I was really pretty fanatical on students doing volunteer work. I think when you do volunteer work, you not only gain a lot from yourself, but you learn a lot and you get a different perspective on helping people. And I was like a candy striper and a Red Cross volunteer, which is where one of my poems takes place.
Oh, yeah, yeah, speaking of that, were you read Smoking Mr. V?
Okay, I was in high school and I volunteered at all of the hospitals in town. Okay. I suddenly lost Mr. V. Oh, here he is. Okay. The best part of his day was smoking. This is when you could smoke anywhere. This is the 60s.
And please say the title.
Smoking Mr. V.
Okay.
That wasn't his real name, of course. The best part of his day was smoking. Quadriplegic, blind, his home a VA hospital bed. He needed a hand. So twice a shift, I held his cigarette into his lips, then out. A rhythm easy enough for a Red Cross volunteer who smoked him after school. Tuesdays, Thursdays, 1962. Since World War II, my dad smoked too. Mr. V, who fought in World War I, was older than my grandfather, and yet he always greeted me, "Hi, beautiful." Gray, shrunken shadow of a man, his body concentrated at the core. A giant head and heart worked overtime. He listened to his bedside radio. "Did you hear Paul Harvey?" he asked. Always something new to chat about during the smoke. He had few visitors. Not everyone calls me beautiful. But it was really delightful, and we had conversations, and I found that a lot of what I did as a volunteer was talk with people, because when people are sick is another way that people are marginalized in our society, and especially if people are sick and old, people don't talk to them, and they spend a lot of time alone, and they usually have rich experiences to share. And I think that's, it don't have to do something really dramatic. I think it's helpful also to try to write legislators, and I did try to run for office once, but that didn't work too well in the state. But I think you can do it. Cesar Chavez, who was a favorite community organizer, always said, you organize by being with one person at a time.
You organize by being with one person at a time. That's amazing.
And that's, I think, how you make change too.
What?
That's how you make change too, I think, with people with their situations, and in poetry. Just writing, having people write, and recognizing that I think people like to know they can do something that they didn't think they could do.
Yeah, poetry, writing poems is a challenge, but when people see themselves rising to that challenge, I bet it's an amazing experience for them.
It is. They really like it. They really.
So there's so much to cover. Will you please read the poem about Brad?
Okay, Brad was my late husband. He was also a psychiatrist, which was also another scary thing. Psychiatrists and poets really scare people, and he was both. But he also liked motorcycles. I mean, he was a regular person, and I think people think poets and doctors, but especially psychiatrists, because people used to ask me if he could read my mind, and I said, "Are you kidding? He doesn't even know it unless I tell him something." But he really liked his motorcycles, and he had a BMW motorcycle for a while, and we got it on the boat even, but then he stopped riding it after he thought he was in his 60s. He didn't think his balance was as good. But this is called Wind. And the wind lives in South Dakota, in case any of you are not from South Dakota out there. The wind lives here. Wind. Motorcycling in South Dakota, we become one with the wind on the prairie, the queen of green and gold, and humans too. Flying down roads, we are corn stalks dancing to exhaustion, like the woman in red shoes. Grasses bow to the wind's power. So do we willingly submit, and on curves commit to another plane for the ride's duration. I'm going to try an experiment with letting him out to see if he can see me. Okay, I'm sorry, but sometimes if he's just near me, he'll be quiet.
So tell us one of the things I first knew about you, aside from being friends with my dad when you both were kids, is that you and Brad were on a boat for how long were you on the boat?
A year.
What was it year like for you?
Oh, it was great. And actually, it was really good for poetry writing because it was a big boat. It was a trawler, like old fishing boats, not a really fancy boat, but it was a big boat. And I'd read that someone got 1,000 books on the boat, and I had to have my books. So I said I could get 1,000 books on because we had an extra stateroom. We had to take out the washer and dryer so I could get my books on. And then it listed, but Brad moved the anchor. But we started in on the Chesapeake Bay in Oxford, and we went down the inner coastal canalway through some hurricanes because we started in September. But by the time we got to the Keys, and we lived in a middle key once we got there, Marathon, which is now gone, it was wiped out by a hurricane. But the rhythm was very good for poetry because you really had to work with the sun. You had to get up and you had to move the boat before wind, and then we were there. We pretty much got up and walked, and it was a rhythm that worked with poetry. And then I read and wrote a lot during the day. I went to bed early. I like to be involved in poetry groups. And there was a group in Key West, which was about maybe 45 minutes from where we lived on the boat. But I went to Key West once a week and met with a group of women in a drugstore down there, where they met.
Did you have a car, or how did you get?
Yeah, we had a car. Somebody brought our car down for us.
Oh,
They
wow.
drove the car down. Yeah, that helped to have a car. We had the motorcycle, but it was on the boat, but Brad didn't use it.
So how did you? Many people contemplate, like, wouldn't it be fun to get a boat and sail for when you're something? But how did you and Brad decide to actually do it?
Well, Brad grew up on Lake Champlain, so he had always been into boats, and we always had a sailboat on the Chesapeake, which we used on weekends. But he always loved boats, and he always wanted to live on a boat for a while. It got increasingly less ambitious. I mean, at one point it was going around the world and going all places, but it's a lot of work to live on a boat. I mean, you're constantly moving and you have to be really careful. I fell off once during a hurricane, and he pulled me up, dislocated my shoulder, but he also treated it. He put me in a sling and then had me do exercises. So it healed perfectly well. I mean, there wasn't anything I could do. It was a hurricane. So it's a lot of work, though. And then we decided after a year, we were in the Keys, and it was getting too close to hurricane time again. So we had to either put the boat up and leave for the season, or do something else. So actually, Brad decided he was tired of living on the boat. This was a lot of work, and we wanted to be on land. So we sold the boat and drove back. We drove to South Dakota. because that was where it's from. And he liked South Dakota. And then we thought we'd just keep going west. But then we ran into your parents and they said, oh, you can find space and land here. So we ended up living in Canton. And we really liked living in Canton. And we came into town for poetry readings and poetry groups because they had, at that time, they were doing poetry readings at the barn. I don't know if you remember that, but it was right
Yeah.
by the river. So,
did you get Brad interested in poetry, or was he interested on his own?
well, he thought, actually, the way you said it before, he thought he couldn't write poetry, but he was an English major, and he was vastly well read, and he'd read a lot of poetry, and he'd taken a lot of poetry classes. Like he took a class just on Yeats.
Wow.
So I said something about, well, I think you could probably write poetry. And when we were living in Canton, and at the time we were both retired for a while, and he started writing poetry. And he always wrote in blank verse, iambic pentameter, because he was used to iambic pentameter. And of course, he'd read a lot of Shakespeare, which is 5 beats. And that's the way the heart beats, actually. So he started writing, and then he found he really liked it. And he always got things published in one contest, and because he was really good. So I think he was a really good poet. And he always read all of my poems, and I always read all of his. So he lived a life of writing poetry pretty much for a few years. And then we both had to go back to work for a while. And then Brad worked for a while after that. And we always went to poetry readings, but he never wrote very much when he was working. And I think that's true. It's harder. I know your father manages to do it, but I think a lot of people don't write as much. But he started writing them when we lived in Canton, seriously. And he hadn't written much since high school.
Wow. So then Brad has passed away. What has it been like not having your companion, your husband, your friend? What has it been like?
Well, it's really hard. I mean, besides missing him as my mate, I mean, we always did things together, and a lot of it was reading and writing. And you don't necessarily always have that in a companion. But that's what he liked to do, and he didn't like to do very active things. And shortly after we moved here, he was diagnosed with an alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which is actually a lung disease that's hereditary, and both of your parents have to have it. So for the last several years of his life, he had a lot of trouble breathing. He was on oxygen 24/7. He didn't want to go out much or do anything, but we still read, and he was my editor, and he also did all kinds of administrative stuff, like he would send off my poems because I had trouble with that submission place, and it was easier. He did a lot on the computer, and he sort of managed a lot of mail and financial stuff. And it's been sort of hard for me to do that. Besides just being here with me, it's really kind of difficult being without him.
What would you tell like a someone who's been recently widowed about going through this painful process?
Well, writing helps a lot. The first month, he died on May 1st in 21. And the first month I didn't do anything. I just sat on the couch and cried, but then I started writing. And I started writing in my journal. It was hard to read, which was difficult to get used to because I'd always been reading. But
you say it was hard to read. Why was it hard to read?
I don't know. There's something after a loss that your concentration isn't there as much. So it was hard, but it was better. I started writing, and I was writing a lot about him. And I think writing through grief is probably one of the most helpful things. I don't know if they deal with that in grief groups. I didn't go to a grief group because I felt kind of strange because I'd recently been certified as a grief therapist. So I thought it'd be kind of weird being part of a group, and I thought I would be, it would be hard for me to not be talking too much.
To be elating. So, so another certification you've gotten is being you're a poetry therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that a little bit, please.
Okay. Well, people think that's weird too. I mean, I have a lot of weird titles. Social worker's weird, poet, therapist. But poetry therapy, people think sounds really strange. But I wanted to do something with poetry, and that was helpful to people. And so I went through the process. I've always been a part of the National Association of Poetry Therapy, and I knew they had an off organization that you could become a certified poetry therapist. Now, nobody knows what that is, and nobody really cares what it is, but it's actually kind of like getting another master's. It's a lot of work, and you have to do a lot of reading and a lot of supervision, and I had to do a lot of groups. So I did a lot of poetry groups and some individual while I was going through that process. And it's not that mysterious because you're helping people tap into themselves. And I used poetry when I was a therapist. I had people read poetry and write poetry, and people actually brought it in on their own, even when I didn't necessarily prompt it. But in groups, you have prompts, and you share. You have the facilitator brings poems, and you talk about them. And I think that helps people because poetry, a lot of people don't read poetry. And when they read it slowly in a group and you read it a few times and start discussing it, you notice things that you would not have noticed before or probably would have just skipped over. And then there's a sense that I think when people read poetry, there's a sense that they see some of themselves that they hadn't thought of, or it sparks a memory. So after reading and discussing poetry, I will give people prompts and we'll write for a while and then share the writing if people feel like it. It's all pretty low keyed in that people don't have to share, but most people want to. I mean, most people want really want people to know them as they are, and they want to know themselves better, so they find that they're writing in poetry therapy about things or memories or parts of their lives that they'd sort of buried and now come out with poetry. But I think poetry brings that out in people, that they start to see different ways of seeing themselves in the world, and also identify, because it's like, oh yeah, I've felt exactly that way. And people like that. Somebody's expressed that.
People will, that connection can be so really meaningful.
Right, because you've had that. Because I mean, you're a poet, and you know that feeling of being connected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. I So you mentioned a lot of uniquenesses, like your husband was unique in his profession and in poetry, and your poet, social worker, poetry therapist, on and on. What would you say to those of us which probably ends up being most humans in the world, about finding courage to be our unique selves in the world? Does
Oh,
that make sense?
yeah, it's a good question. I think sometimes people may find it in poetry, but they may find it someplace else in terms of a creative outlet, or just doing some kind of volunteering or helping or being in nature. A lot of people find a lot of solace in nature. I mean, and there's a lot of nature poetry, but I think observing what's going on in the world around us is a really important part of feeling like you're courageous enough to take time to notice what's happening. And then it may come out in some creative manner. It may just be collecting rocks, and it might be making a collage. It might be, in Japan, they call being with nature forest bathing. It's just being out there and being with nature. And I think that gives us a sense of being, there's something bigger than us, but also gives us the courage to be ourselves as we get closer to being with nature, and maybe trying something that we haven't tried before. Does that make sense?
So I hadn't thought of it quite this way before, but you're basically saying we find courage in life by doing things, by taking action, by being out in nature, by writing, by
Volunteering or by doing
volunteer.
something, even just visiting with someone. I think we find the courage to step out of our own box.
Hmm.
And you can do that in a lot of ways, and they don't have to be giant steps, and you don't have to do something dramatic like, jump out of an airplane or something. They can be just doing something, even taking a different route or talking to a person you hadn't talked to before. I think if you find courage to interact with your environment as yourself, that makes you feel more courageous.
Wow. It's really inspiring. Really inspiring. I ask all my guests this: what does doing your imperfect best mean to you?
It means writing really bad poems. Sometimes, sometimes my poems are really awful, but you have to write. And I'm trying to be a little bit more gentle with myself. I get tired, and I get frustrated sometimes. Like going back and forth between doing things for my mom and doing things for Elliot, who's also aging. But now he's right next to me, so he's being quiet. I'm trying to be more gentle with myself, which I think is important because we're not perfect. We're not supposed to be perfect. And my mom's pretty wise, and she's lived over a century, and she'll always say, "Well, I don't expect anybody to be perfect. Like if I'm crabby, because I'm tired, she says, well, that's okay. You can be crabby." And I think accepting yourself as you are and making mistakes and just going ahead and doing something anyway is helpful. I mean, so I do take chances. I write bad poems or be crabby or sometimes I do like to travel. I haven't traveled very much because of the responsibilities with my mom and my dog, but I've traveled. I mean, I will just take off and go someplace.
So your newest book is Winter Woman. Where can people? Is this on Amazon?
Yeah, most things are on Amazon.
Cool. Well, congratulations. It's a beautiful book. And it's been fascinating talking with you. We've known each other for years, but we've never had this conversation.
Right.
Do you have any last words for this podcast about talking to people we've known for a long time and having a deeper conversation with them?
That's another good question. Yeah, I think that we don't do that. I think if we just ask people a question like you're doing on your podcast, which is really good, it gives people a chance to talk about things that most people wouldn't ask about or you wouldn't think about talking about. So that if you ask somebody a question like you do and you ask thoughtful questions, then people will probably share something new. And I think anybody can do that with somebody they know. And a lot of times people haven't even done that with their parents. Now, I happen to have done it a lot with my mom because I helped her do a memoir, but most of the time we don't. And then people are gone and we wish we'd known something. So I would say take the courage to talk to anybody and maybe share one of your experiences first so people feel comfortable, or ask them about something that's sort of unusual because people usually do routine questions.
How are you doing today?
Right. I sometimes say I'm doing awful and then people don't say anything. Some days are awful. You're not always good.
Yeah, some days are awful. So if last thing, so if someone says I'm doing awful, what's a good response to them saying that?
Oh, I would say something like, well, tell me about it. What's awful about it?
And that's a good point. Our questions don't always have to be elaborate. Sometimes
right.
is just as simple as please tell me more.
Right. That's true. I mean, that happens a lot in therapy. People they may ask some probing questions, but a lot of times it's getting people to talk about their lives. And we don't do that very much. But I think if we share, we share our common humanity more and appreciate differences more than we have when we don't share. And I think that's a big problem right now. I mean, people don't interact with people in very positive ways. And stories do that, and poems do that.
Well, this has been delightful.
Well, I've enjoyed it. It sort of went off in a slightly different direction, like things usually do.
Yeah. I mean, for everyone listening, we had a lot more poems you were going to read and stuff, but I think this conversation just was. I mean, what you shared was excellent. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for asking the questions.
You're welcome. And thank you, people watching, for tuning in. Please tune in for another awkwardly awesome podcast guest next week, which means I get to have another awkwardly awesome podcast conversation, which is so fun. And yeah, to everyone out there, thanks for being you.
Well, and thank you for being you and doing that. And thanks for everybody out there. This is a service that you're doing, and you are sharing a lot of yourself and other people and putting it out there. So that's courageous. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Please stay on. I want to talk to you afterwards. Okay.
Okay, I will.
Until next week.